What a pleasure to be with all of you here today. You know, one of the great misfortunes in the world is untapped, unfulfilled promise, unexplored human potential. Do you know your potential? Now, I loved my grandfather, and he had many amazing abilities, but one of them really captured my imagination. He'd asked me to bring him an empty soup can, and with a pair of old tin snips and a little cutting and bending, he would transform in a moment that soup can into a flying dove. Now, this wasn't a magic trick. He could really do that. He was able to recognize and to realize the hidden potential in that soup can that nobody else could see. Now, my grandfather and I talked a lot about how the initials of his name, MBR, sounded out the word ember. So as a young person, I really thought a lot about what an ember is. Now, you can look at an ember in two different ways, either as the remnant of a dying fire or as the latent potential harboring the DNA of a raging fire. Now, people who view it the second way know that with just the slightest breath of air and the right fuel, that ember will transform into a raging fire. And the important thing to remember is that the line between those two states is very thin, but it's very real. Now, I think it's much the same with people. I originally trained as a lawyer and then became a counselor and advocate for students and professionals in all disciplines throughout the world. And I believe that the core of every person, their essence, gifts, inclinations, and values, really is just like that ember. Because it's just loaded with possibility, and it's simply waiting to be engaged. Attuning somebody to that core, to the essence of who they are, is no different than blowing on an ember. And the problem is that people are often so distracted from being mindful of their core, as well as its power, that they don't fully engage it in their private, personal life, in their academic life, or in their professional life. And they forget what it represents, they forget what it offers, and they forget what it might make possible. Really what happens is that all of us sometimes pay only fleeting, almost secret visits to our core. So we lose an appreciation of that core, actually the relationship between that core and to the rest of the world. And we don't see the opportunities that flow from it in the present hour, this second, or this moment. So because of these distractions, many of the decisions we make are not well grounded and they're not well defined. And then the world loses out on the contributions that we might otherwise have made by virtue of our presence in this world. So, to my mind, the world becomes a little bit more misaligned, a little bit out of system, a little bit out of kilter when people make decisions that are distanced from who they truly are. So among the powerful forces in this world that distract us from being mindful of who we are the assumptions that we make. And the thing is that we make these assumptions oftentimes without being aware that we're doing it. Now, they undercut your thinking, and it's really about the negative power of assumptions that I'd like to talk to you about today, so that you can be aware of them, challenge them, and try to avoid the assumptions that limit you. Assumptions are very much like the sleights of hand that a magician uses to distract you. And this makes them very dangerous and all the more powerful as influences over your thinking. So what are these assumptions? Well, They come in 3 different categories, and all of them basically limit your potential by altering the lens through which you view yourself, through which you view others, through which you view the world. So the first one I'd like to discuss with you are the assumptions that we make about ourselves. Now, ironically, because they come so naturally, we often don't notice our greatest gifts. And this is because essentially of 2 different assumptions. First, we assume that because these gifts come so easily, that they must not have much value. And second, that because these gifts come so easily, they must come easily for everybody. And assumptions like this really distract us from our core and from our possibilities, because when we make them, we mistakenly dismiss or undervalue such important talents that may represent gifts that we have that are truly unique, gifts that hold the keys and the clues to our future. You know, recognizing these gifts makes it possible to have a much more extraordinary life, to have much more fulfilling work, to meet more extraordinary people, and to contribute in a world that's more consistent with why you're here. The second type of assumption relates to those we make about others. Now, we often assume that things are as they appear, and they're not. Carl Menninger, a very famed psychiatrist, once compared the struggles of a fish who's hooked to the struggles of a human being. It's really difficult, Menninger noted, for a free fish to understand what's happening to a hooked fish. And similarly, he notes that the external struggles of man against his environment and against the difficulties that he faces are all that the world sees. And so naturally the world misunderstands them. And many of us are hooked on lines that others can't see. And we're often hooked on lines that we can't see. And many of the people we deal with are hooked on lines that we can't see. So the point is that we're often all too quick to make assumptions about what we see. We have to be mindful that what we see is not all that exists. If we don't look more deeply for what might actually be going on, then our decisions, our communications with others, and all of our actions can be compromised. Now, for example, I've met a lot of young students who have been labeled high risk, low potential by different faculty and administrators. Now, these administrators see certain behaviors and then make negative inferences about these students on the basis of those behaviors without looking more deeply to the circumstances that may be driving those behaviors. And this often happens in the home, this happens at work, and the same kind of thing happens in the community. Many of the ways that these students appear have no relationship to who they actually are or what their capacities are. At least in my experience, I've found that a great many of these students have the same hopes and dreams as the other students, and in many cases have abilities and capacities that far exceed some of the abilities that certain faculty administrators might see in other students. So an important point is that many of these young people are simply on hooks that are unseen by others who are not familiar with their particular backgrounds, experience, and natures. So when you buy in to what certain people say about others, you need to be very careful about looking deeper to make sure that you are not inaccurately affected by those words. Because if you do buy into it, then there's a negative impact on you and your life just as it is on these other people. Now, one of my law school professors, Roger Fisher, always stressed that people assume that a position somebody takes is final because that's what it appears to be. But the reality is that when someone is confronted with a position that's final, they respond with another position. And so you've got position against position, and nothing happens. So the idea is that if, instead of responding with a position and assuming that something is final, they look more deeply for the interests that underlie that position, not only more deeply for the interests of other person, but also more deeply for the interests that they have, so that they can find shared interests that bring about a meeting of minds. Unless they're able to do that, they limit their potential for effective communication, as well as limiting the potential for the development of productive future relationships. We also assume sometimes that the advice of a trusted expert is correct. Though such a person might act in good faith and have the best of intent, and may to others seem as if the advice they're giving is rational and reasonable, it might not be for you. And that's because that their frame of reference, their range of experience, and their value system may be very different from your own. And they might not have the capacity for understanding you as a unique person. Now, the third type of assumption are those we make about what's possible. Now, I've always deeply valued what Arthur Schopenhauer had said, that every person takes the limits of their own field of vision for the limits of the world. But I've appreciated that for the poetry and meaning of what he's saying, but also because it reminds me of a scene from the film The Princess Bride, written by the great screenwriter William Goldman, where the brave princess and the fearless Wesley, her dear friend, have been both courageously responding to one challenge after another and are now being chased by the evil prince. So, as they're running along, they are suddenly faced with the dreaded fire swamp. Now, you got to understand what this fire swamp is all about. The second you enter it, there are these random bursts of fire that pretty much fry anybody that tries to cross it. And if you get past the fire, then it's the quicksand. And if you get past the fire and the quicksand, you still have to face the giant rodents who are known for making it impossible for anyone to see another day. So at this point, after all they've overcome and all they've been through, the princess looks out at this death trap and says, "We'll never survive." And Wesley grins back. "Nonsense. You're only saying that because no one ever has." In life, from time to time, we all face fire swamps, but with a mix of determination and resourcefulness and the presence of mind to use your unique skills, knowledge, and experience to face the moment at hand, that there is always a way, with of course a little assistance from our friends, to make it through those fire swamps. It's never so much about the fire swamp. It's always more about how you respond to it. Now, the idea is to take action. So we've spoken about three kinds of assumptions: those we make about ourselves, those we make about others, and those we make about what's possible. So consider for a moment whether there is truly evidence to support the limiting assumptions you have made, and consider whether that evidence would really hold up in the courtroom of the 12 people who believe in you the most. Now, remember, I'm not saying that all assumptions are incorrect, but what I am asking you to do is to challenge your assumptions. I'm asking you to be aware of and consider the assumptions you're making and those that may be limiting you. To ask yourself whether those assumptions apply uniquely to you and whether there's objective evidence to support those assumptions. So for a moment, think about a limiting assumption that you might be making, whether it's about yourself, whether it's about others, or some aspect of your life. And imagine that you have rethought this assumption. Imagine what your life might be like if you eliminated this assumption from your mind. Imagine what it would be like if this assumption was no longer blanketing your ember, your core being. Blow on that ember. And imagine your core being flared. Invoke this potential for a moment and let a vision emerge of your own core potential bursting into flame. Because it is here, in this place of mind, in this place of greater clarity, that you can be more truly mindful of the gifts and the callings that flow from your core, and of the unique contributions that will be made by the noble human being that each of you was brought here to become. Thank you very much.